Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Laura Gunderson, and I'm the Oregonian OregonLive Editorial Board editor. I'm here today with Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Great to be with you. Greetings.
Well, we're hoping to hear a little bit about your recent trip to North Korea. What a fascinating time to be there.
Well, it was valuable to go and speak to folks in Japan, in South Korea, in China, and to talk to people who have defected from North Korea, including one high-placed diplomat, about the challenges of trying to rein in the nuclear program in North Korea. And we had the experience of being on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, between North and South Korea, where you actually, as you enter a blue Quonset hut for negotiation, you're actually standing inside North Korea. So I guess I can say I was actually in North Korea. And also went to the border of Dandong between China and North Korea, which is no congressional delegation has gone there before, and that provides insights on really the supply of goods and the control that China has over the economy in North Korea, but also their reluctance to exercise that in a powerful way.
Well, it seems awfully scary on this end when we hear the tweet storms that goes back and forth, the name calling. What does it feel like when you're standing there, and how is that resonating?
Well, what we heard from everyone is that the president's commentary is making it far more difficult to have the North Koreans freeze their program, that the argument that Kim Jong-un has been making to his elite power group is that these weapons are needed because of the threat from the United States, and our president's statements have reinforced that. It's very clear that there is probably a pathway currently to freezing their program, both their ballistic missile long-range program and their nuclear warhead program. But doing so is going to take enormous cooperation with the entire international community. And there were 3 or 4 ideas that came out of the trip that haven't been widely discussed in the international community that I think were valuable.
Like?
Well, for example, the elite in North Korea really care a tremendous amount about their children being able to study abroad. So if China and the rest of the world, United States, said, look, if you test another long-range missile, if you test another warhead, and if you don't come to the negotiating table, here are some things that will happen. One is the entire world will revoke your student visas. That would be very, very disruptive. At first, it doesn't sound like a big weapon, but it's so important to the elite, is what we heard from the defectors. Second of all, that the smuggling that occurs across the border of China could be shut down and have a big impact. Third, North Korea gains a huge amount of revenue, hard currency, from its workers abroad. They get 80% of the pay goes to the government of North Korea, and 1/5, 20%, goes to the worker. And so that source of currency, if the world said all your workers will be sent home and you will cut off your hard currency like that, if you test these, that would be very powerful. And then the role of oil. Oil is essential to their economy. Both Russia and China have a pipeline. If those two countries cooperate and say they would cut off if those occurred, those are the things that are real points of pressure. Oil is discussed a lot, but some of the other pieces that could be done could be significant in creating disruption among the elite of North Korea, which Kim Jong-un is very concerned about.
And where does China fall into that in terms of the pressure they want, what benefits they have? The fears they have.
So China is willing to apply pressure and has cut off oil before to get North Korea to the negotiating table. However, they are afraid if they simply create chaos in North Korea without a clear plan, a clear achievable objective, that they'll end up with hundreds of thousands of refugees inside China, which they do not want. They're also concerned that in the course of that chaos, you may end up with a unified peninsula with a country that is hostile to China, or at least not sympathetic to China. And they want that buffer state. So they are willing to apply pressure under a very clear international plan, but they're going to be careful not to apply so much pressure that they create chaos.
And all this work is happening. I mean, that sounds very hopeful and good compared to where I think a lot of Americans think we are on that front. So this work continues despite the tweet storm.
Well, I'm afraid that the inconsistency of the administration has really undermined the ability to achieve these objectives. For example, it's very important to China that we not be pushing to take out the leadership of North Korea. And in fact, a commitment to not take out the leadership is essential to the North Koreans willing to come to the negotiating table. But after our Secretary of State said we're absolutely not trying to do that, Pompeo proceeded to say that's exactly what we want to do. So it is not a carefully coordinated strategy. And just recently, with Secretary of State saying he was working very hard to establish channels of communication, and President Trump then attacked him in a tweet, saying that's hopeless and pointless. That's very unhelpful. Without the authority of the president behind him, he cannot hope to have any cooperation.
Well,
so it's not such great news. I'm going to say, years ago, decades ago, I worked for Secretary Weinberger and focused on strategic nuclear policy. I worried a lot about nuclear weapons in first use, and it's been decades since I've had that concern. But the types of comments coming out of the United States, out of the president, which make this situation more tense and less likely to be resolved, I have worries now that I haven't had in a long time.
And in terms of where those worries are on American soil, obviously a lot of people have loved ones in Guam. There are concerns for Japan. Where else at this point do we think there could be a direct hit that could hurt Americans?
Well, this conversation always revolves around the delivery of nuclear warheads by missiles. And North Korea has a very inconsistent record in that regard. Even their longer-range missiles haven't developed the reentry vehicles necessary to survive the turbulence of reentry, the heat of reentry. However, weapons can be moved around the planet in many other ways. There could be one of North Korea's nuclear weapons sitting on a boat somewhere in the world now that could move into New York Harbor. And we should not be so arrogant as to believe that any place in the world is safe should we choose to use a nuclear weapon in North Korea. And by the way, such a choice would just be horrific in terms of humanitarian terms. It'd be horrific in terms of U.S. influence in the world. It would be a mistake on every level. So every time the president talks about fire and fury or the obliteration of North Korea, suggesting such a strike, he's really undermining the confidence of the international community to work with us and really disturbing the type of work that Tillerson was trying to do to take us forward.
Well, in other uplifting news, but closer to home, we have heard recently that it sounds as if we're going to lose some of the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, which, of course, there are folks on the ground there that are happy to have that movement, to have that reconsideration, but there's a lot of others who are scared that we'll either lose the recent expansion or even some of the monument boundary that was set by President Clinton. So what are we hearing there, and how sure is that? Is it still on the to-do list? Yes,
there's a leaked memo that the Interior Secretary Zinke is recommending a shrinking of 4 monuments, including the Cascade-Siskiyou. It is not at all clear that will actually happen. It has not happened before. There have been adjustments to boundaries, but not with the goal of essentially undoing what has been kind of the scientifically guided protection of key assets. Key assets have included very special parts of the United States, areas that sometimes become national parks. What we have in the Cascade-Siskiyou is a scientific consensus that the current boundaries are insufficient to protect the very unique ecosystem, plants, animals that live in the juncture of 3 mountain ranges and the Great Basin. So a lot of work was put in to follow the recommendations for additional protection. The initial expansion plan was shrunk considerably before President Obama approved it. And I think it would be a big mistake in terms of that monument to shrink it, but it would also be a mistake in terms of the role of monuments. No president has come into office saying, I'm going to undo the work of former presidents. Make tweaks and adjustments, but this is a very different idea of taking 4 monuments and shrinking them. And what it would say is that a monument is no longer something that we can count on being there in the future. Our next president could come in and wipe them all out if this was to hold up. There will be a big court battle if President Trump proceeds in this direction.
Are you seeing any wiggle room or negotiation space with Zinke? And I believe I heard that you guys have had some meetings and were talking through this. How has that been? Is there any hope that could be adjusted despite this memo?
Well, yes. I mean, there will be a dialogue over it. However, I was disappointed with the recommendation. Zinke had said he wanted to be a Theodore Roosevelt-style Republican. He wanted to follow the science. When he came back and met with Senator Wyden and myself, he was uninterested in the science that had led to the boundaries being modified. And so that was disappointing, and I hope he'll respect the great majority of Oregonians who wanted to see this expansion. People weighed in 4-1 in favor of it, and I hope he'll respect the science.
Do you hear anything? Obviously, the counties in those areas had pushback on this plan, and kind of at the same time, on a different track, President Trump has pulled back on some of these committees and these groups that do work on these very types of issues on the ground in places like this, not so much on the monument front, but in terms of grazing, as you well know, and wildfire, trying to prevent wildfires through restoration. Is there any hope that this decision could be taken back to the communities and could be pounded out by the people who are affected most? Well,
there were 3 or 4 public gatherings for people to weigh in, and thousands of letters came in. And it never hurts to have significant citizen input. It's not clear to me why the input would be different than the first time around. People came to the town halls saying, we were very concerned about this expansion because we love to hunt. Well, hunting has always been allowed in the Cascade-Siskiyou. People came and said, we're very concerned because we like to fish. Well, fishing has always been allowed. There were a lot of misconceptions that were cleared up in the process. People said, oh, all the roads will be shut down. No, this is not wilderness. This is a monument. The roads can be right where they are. So you facilitate access. And so I'm not sure the conversation would be different, but dialogue with the community would be far preferable to simply having Zinke, who does not understand Oregon at all, and is totally understood in the science, despite his earlier affirmations that he was, setting out a path.
Mm-hmm. And any idea when a timeline on that decision will be?
No, it's really, we don't know if the president's even ever looked at the recommendations or so forth. There's a few other issues going on, so who knows when this will show up again.
Yeah, well, perhaps that's good for a while.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that to just sit for a while.
Well, also, I was interested this week to read about the panel that was held at Portland State to talk about the sexual assault allegations, how college campuses handle sexual assault allegations based on Betsy DeVos's comments about changing the guidelines and possibly changing the rules. Is this, again, one of these things that might take a really long time? It's being talked about. Maybe just the guidelines will change, but it won't affect universities. And also, what are you hearing from university leaders in terms of would they be open to making any changes?
So my best guess is that DeVos will probably proceed with changing the guidelines. What she wants to do is to get rid of the timeliness, that is the 6-month provision, and say it needs to happen in a timely fashion but without the 6-month parameter. And she wants to change the guidelines for the standard of evidence. The standard of evidence she's leaning towards is a criminal court standard of evidence, which many colleges feel is completely inappropriate to an administrative action. And the current guideline is preponderance of the evidence, which basically says that you listen carefully to both sides and see which side has the stronger case. This is not proof beyond a shadow of a doubt, if you will. And knowing that victims are very unlikely to report violence under a criminal standard means that this preponderance of the evidence structure is very important to deterrence of violence in the first place, which is the best event. That never happens. The sexual assault never happens. And so it goes hand in hand with training or guidance, teaching of students, hand in hand with the way students who have experienced an assault are treated when they experience it. Portland State has a great set of rules for the place that they talk to the victim. They call it a soft room. The strategy is to give complete control to the victim so they're not worried that you're going to take this out of my hand and do things without my permission that I don't want to happen. And in an attack you have a loss of control that as a victim, then when you speak to officials, you want to have that control back, and they really seem to understand this, and they have the guidance, the coaching, the resources, the assistance ready to be there, but make sure that the victim guides how that's utilized.
Well, and there are so many things that I think Americans and Oregonians also are fearful of right now. Is this really one we need to be afraid of, or is this something where you have a strong sense that our campuses here have no plans to change and wouldn't be held responsible for changing because of what's happening at the federal level?
I think it's very unlikely our campuses would change just because the guidance changes. I think they're everything I've heard from them is that they're very satisfied with the strategy they have now. The general level of assaults when surveys are done is that 1 out of 5 women in college experience an assault. I have a daughter in college. I have a son in college. The idea that you have a 1 in 5 chance of being sexually assaulted is horrendous. We need to adopt the type of strategies that Portland State has adopted in order to change that substantially. And I think most colleges are determined to change it.
Yeah. And you had at the panel Brenda Tracy, who the Oregonian Stan Canzano had talked to a great deal, had helped share her story. Is there, she's been such an advocate on this front, and also Betsy DeVos was in town this week. Was there any type of meeting or discussion about what this looks like to somebody who's gone through it and what that would feel like, as opposed to just talking about guidelines on paper?
No, Brenda has been an amazing advocate, and I think many of the things that we have seen and the changes that colleges have done have come out of her relaying how things were done wrong when she was assaulted and what she experienced afterwards. And it's still, she gave a very emotional commentary here after all these years. It's still, it's still a very deep wound. And you think of college as a place where your children go to blossom, explore the world, try to figure out their path in life, learn a great deal, go on internships. All of that beautiful opportunity is destroyed by an attack. And so we have to take this extremely seriously. I doubt Betsy DeVos met with Brenda. If she did, I'm not aware of it. I did not hear about that. But that would be a terrific meeting to occur. And one of the things we also talked about is that it's very important for our athletic programs to proceed to be much stricter about transfer athletes, and that transfer athletes not be allowed to essentially be in trouble for violence in one college and then get out of trouble by transferring to another.
Right, having a level of consistency across the NCAA. And I believe you were on that letter, weren't you?
Yes.
How
Senator White and I wrote, I think February of last year. And we've followed up joining some other letters urging action. I'm not satisfied that big sports really isn't satisfactorily addressing this as far as I'm concerned.
For that matter, has Oregon State?
Well, so that is a good question on the transfer piece, because I've read conflicting accounts, and so I was just telling my team this morning that it'd probably be useful for Senator Wyden and I and the delegation to write to the presidents and connect to the presidents here in Oregon about how they are addressing the broader set of issues, but also this transfer student issue. Right.
So at least Oregonians can understand what's happening at their own colleges.
Yes.
Well, the other thing, of course, that's coming out of Washington that is, in fits and starts at least, it sounds like, with tax reform. And I think some states, in particular, it seems politically opposed to the president, feel as if they're being targeted in so much as they'll be hit particularly hard by some of these changes. In Oregon, for instance, not being able to write off state taxes. Where is that? And again, what is the likelihood in this going forward? Are we...
So the initial Republican plan is a wish list for the wealthiest Americans. For the lowest third, it has nothing in it of help, although it's been paired with a budget resolution that would take $500 billion out of Medicaid. Yet another battle over health care. And of course, Oregon has been more effective at using Medicaid than virtually any other state in the country, so that really would hurt us. The middle third in America, some of them would see a tax increase, some a decrease, but not much change overall. But the wealthiest Americans, they benefit in every possible way. While the bottom tax bracket is raised, so you'd pay more taxes at the bottom, the top bracket is lowered. In addition, if you can take your income and turn it into a limited liability corporation, there's a special pass-through provision to a very low rate. So, for example, if you own property and you're currently reported on a Schedule E, you could do an LLC and then get a special low tax rate on that. The president is reported to have some hundreds, some estimate 500 to 800 LLCs that he'd get a special tax rate on. Then the alternative minimum tax would be wiped out. What we know is of the one return that has been leaked of the president's returns is that the only reason he paid taxes because alternative minimum tax, so you wipe that out. And then you wipe out the dynasty tax. That is the estate tax that now the levels have been raised where it's really only the richest, very richest Americans who pay it, and it substitutes for capital gains at death. So it tries to make sure essentially that people pay a fair share of capital gains, so this is well over $1 trillion. It's estimated perhaps $1.5 trillion, virtually all the benefits going to the richest Americans, while $1 trillion comes out of Medicare and $500 billion comes out of Medicaid in the budget resolution. And then there's even more in there, and we're trying to really figure that out because the economists are still estimating that it would massively increase the deficit as well.
So can we expect that anything will happen? Are we going to look at the ACA train wreck again? Is there any possibility that this will have any type of bipartisan support, any little bits and pieces of it, or are we expecting another nice long few months of nothing?
You know, there's absolutely a foundation for bipartisan work. We have so many deductions and credits in our corporate tax system that we have a high nominal rate, but the effective rate is much lower. And economists point out time and time again would be better to have a lower rate and get rid of all those deductions and credits. Oregon has the same problem. We have the same problem in our corporate tax. And I was part of an effort years ago to lower the rate and get rid of the credits and deductions, level it out, and it was an impossible task because every group that benefits from a particular deduction or credit hires an army of lobbyists, and so people who have these benefits want to make sure that they don't lose them, and that's why it's so hard. That's why it's been since Senator Packwood from Oregon championed the 1986 tax reform, we have not seen a significant change. So that's just the corporate piece. That's very hard, and I don't see much bipartisan cooperation on the general structure of the changes at the individual level, because this is an enormous rate on the Treasury for the best off in our society. And the best off are really well off. Now the top 0.1%, so 1 out of 1,000, the richest 1 out of 1,000, has as much as 900 other Americans. So 0.1% versus 90%. And these provisions would simply increase that. And you don't increase the success of the economy in terms of more money in the hands of companies unless they can sell their products. And so they're sitting on a lot of money right now, trillions of dollars, and the big companies. And they're sitting on it because demand is saturated. So the only way to increase the economy is to provide more in the way of spending power for most of America, which also increases the welfare of most of America. So that's what I'd like to see us do. It'd be good for the economy, good for business, and good for working Americans. That's my hope.
Yeah. Well, before we go to some questions from Facebook Live, all of that sounds a little bit like the last part of our conversation, what we might hear on a presidential campaign trail. There's discussions of you're looking at that. You've been to Iowa. What are we...
Well, I was very complimented by those stories. I'll take it as a compliment. I was invited to the Corn Feed, which is a progressive gathering of Iowans, in part because of my battle on a number of fronts for working Americans, including trying to stop the theft of a Supreme Court seat, which unfortunately was completed. And so it's one invitation. I notice I've read stories that I've been to Iowa a lot. I've been there once.
But you beat Bernie Sanders. I think that's the point that everybody was trying to make.
Well, Bernie will probably be invited to the Corn Feed next year.
Yes. So
I'm focused on 2018. I have 25 colleagues who are up for election out of the 33 Senate seats, which is really an astounding situation, the imbalance. So I'm doing everything I can to help them, and that's what I'm focused on.
Well, and what is that? What are Democrats doing to show Americans that they get it, that we're here because of not necessarily getting it last year. So I haven't necessarily noticed that Democrats are doing anything different to get that message across.
You know, I was so after the primary, because I had endorsed Bernie in the primary, I was doing all I could to help bring that energy over to assist Hillary, and I was sent to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio, Michigan. So I was in those industrial states. And I do think our presidential campaign, Hillary's presidential campaign, did not understand how the trade treaties have impacted working America. And Trump made a very specific point about this. It boils down to this. If you and I both have a company, and you're in China and I'm an American, and I'm playing by American rules, and you're playing by Chinese rules of very low wages, no environmental rules, no enforcement, you're going to make things cheaper than I am. So if I give you full access to the American market, you're going to put me out of business. And that has happened across our society. And it's often argued that, well, we'll get the benefit of access to the Chinese market. But for the same reason the Chinese can make things cheaper for the American market, they can make things cheaper for the Chinese market. So it's a losing proposition for middle-class America. We won't have a middle class if we don't make things in America. Trump got this. He campaigned on it. Hillary didn't. And the irony is the position he took is the position that the Democrats have championed, that I have championed. And we better understand how much that resonated. That people, there's nothing better than a living wage full-time job as a foundation for a family. If we don't fight for that, then we'll be out of power for a long time.
Well, we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap this up. We've got a few questions from Water. Thank you so much for coming in
welcome.
today.
You're
I so
welcome.
appreciate that, and thank you for everybody who is listening out there.